A businessman likes to visit sages who ever entered their village. One day, a great sage visited his village. The businessman visited the sage and asked him to give a few pieces of advice about life. The sage replied, "Look, my dear, if I give you any advice for free, you will definitely forget about them, and there is no use for me to give you any advice. So why bother?" The businessman didn't give up. He continued to request the sage's advice. The sage finally agreed on one condition: each piece of advice would cost $100. The businessman checked his pockets. He had $400, so he immediately agreed. Then the sage gave his first advice. If you ever see a person who is lower than you suddenly become rich or powerful, respect him as per his current position. Don't make fun of him just because he was lower than you previously. The businessman found it useful and was very happy with the advice. Then the businessman asked for another piece of advice since he still had $300 left. The sage told him, if you ever find a secret of someone, never be the first person to reveal that secret, no matter what. The businessman again liked the second advice and asked for another one. The sage told him, avoid the small works which can be done by servants or others. Let them do those works. You should focus on big events that require your attention. The businessman found this advice also helpful and asked for one last piece of advice. Then the sage told him, if you ever get hurt by the people you trust the most, or if your heart was broken, never stay in that place, not even for a minute. Move to another place immediately. The businessman was very happy to receive those pieces of advice from the sage, and left for his house with empty pockets. After a few days, the businessman lost all of his wealth and decided to move to another city so that he could find some work or start a new business. His loyal servant insisted on following his master. The businessman agreed because his servant was very loyal and helpful. The two reached a town and spent the night there. In the morning, the businessman sent his servant to buy breakfast for both of them. The servant took the money and went to buy breakfast. On the other hand, some royal guards were looking for the person who would enter the city gates to make that person their king. According to tradition, they had to choose a new king since the current king had no heir. They decided to make the first person to enter their city the king. The servant entered the city to buy breakfast, and the royal guards took him to their palace. The servant had no idea why the guards brought him to the palace. The guards made him king, and explained everything to him. The servant told the guards to look for his master because his master was waiting for him and was worried since the servant hadn't returned. The guards came to the place where they both spent the night, and explained to the master that they had taken the servant to the palace. When the master saw the servant on a royal throne, he immediately greeted the servant with, "Greetings, my dear majesty." The servant was very happy that his master treated him like the king. Then the servant felt like a king because before he was unsure and hesitant, since he always thought he was the servant and not the king. Though he was his master's servant, when the master called him king and your majesty, the servant felt like a real king. This was the first advice that the master bought from the sage for $100. The servant who became the king asked his master to stay in the palace as his minister. The master agreed and became the minister, giving advice to the new king, his servant. After a few days passed, the whole kingdom was in peace and prosperity. One day, while the businessman was walking through the garden, he saw the queen having an affair with a security guard. He felt very uncomfortable and left the garden. At first, he wanted to tell the king about the queen's affair, but he suddenly remembered the second advice he bought from the sage, so he decided not to be the first person to reveal the queen's affair. The queen noticed the businessman and was afraid that he would reveal her secret to the king. So she came up with a plan to kill the businessman before he revealed her secret. She visited the king without notice, with a crying and devastated look. The king was shocked to see the queen in that state and asked her, "What happened? Who did this to you? My dear, whoever it is, I will make sure to sentence that person to death, no matter what." The queen started telling a false story that the businessman insulted her. The king was heartbroken and couldn't believe that his master did this to his wife. Since he had already given his word to the queen, he decided to kill the businessman. However, he wanted to save his master's dignity in front of his people, so he didn't openly sentence the businessman to death. Instead, he told his royal chef to kill the person who ever enters the kitchen wearing the king's necklace. On the other hand, the king summoned the businessman and told him that tomorrow was a special day, so he had told the royal chef to cook some special dish, and he couldn't trust anyone but the businessman to bring the recipe from the chef. He gave the businessman his necklace and said, "Wear this necklace and show it to the chef, then only he will give you the dish." The next day, a few soldiers informed the king that the queen was having an affair with some guards. The king guessed the truth and sentenced his wife and the guard to prison. Since it was already midday and late to save his master, he started crying loudly, realizing his mistake. But suddenly, he heard a voice asking, "What happened, your majesty? Why are you crying?" Hearing his master's voice, the king felt happy and grateful for his escape from death. Then the king explained everything to his master and asked for his forgiveness. The businessman started worrying and told the king that while he was going to visit the royal chef, the prince approached him and insisted on seeing the special dish. I remembered the third advice from the sage. Hence the prince, who is the king's son, took the necklace, and I told him to show it to the chef to get the recipe. The king rushed to the royal kitchen and saw his dead son on the floor. He took his son into his arms and cried, saying, "This is the punishment that God was supposed to give me, not you, my son." The next day, the businessman decided to leave the kingdom. The businessman was heartbroken because of the misery. He informed the king and leave the kingdom.